Creepy. Yeah, that's hey, second service. How we doing? Fantastic. Any Fresno State fans in the house? We got a yeah. Yesterday was a bummer, though, was it not? I mean, it was a huge bummer. Hey, this last week, I was able to travel to Colombia, South America, with our youngest daughter, Alice. With Compassion International. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Compassion International, it's a nonprofit organization that started in 1950. Their story is actually fairly incredible. A pastor named Everett Swanson made his way down to South Korea during the Korean War to hang out with some of the American soldiers. And one of the things that he grew increasingly troubled by was the amount of orphans that he saw, I mean, just children just abandoned in the streets. And one morning, as he was just taking a walk, he actually saw city workers sort of scooping up what looked to be like piles of rags. And so Pastor Swanson sort of made his way a little closer to see what was happening, and he realized it was not a pile of rags. Those were actually children that had frozen to death overnight, and they were scooping up their bodies and putting them in the backs of trucks. Well, this was obviously not okay with Everett Swanson, and he came home and he began to incorporate what he saw into his teachings on Sunday mornings and different little revivals and things that he spoke at. And the people he was speaking to actually just sort of began to respond, and they began to donate money, and soon all sorts of supplies were being purchased and sent back to South Korea. And within 10 years, they were actually sponsoring 108 different orphanages. Wow, I'm not speaking well today. And homes in South Korea began to receive support. That's how Compassion International sort of got its start. Today, Compassion International is actually the world's largest, most respected child advocacy organization in the world that pairs compassionate people with children living in extreme poverty. Their goal is to release children from spiritual, economic, social, and physical poverty. And by extreme poverty, I mean quite literally the most extreme poverty that exists on planet Earth. They only work with villages and people that are living on about $2.50 or less a day. And I had the opportunity to make several home visits in a variety of villages that Alice and I were spending some time in. Homes, quite literally. I mean, no paved roads anywhere. Homes made of mud and bamboo sticks, tin roofs, dirt floors, no running water, one light bulb that would sometimes work. Literally, in one home, we were in just a giant bucket, a bucket that maybe stood this high, just filled with water with a smaller bucket in it, and that was it. That was their water, and it was certainly water that Alice and I, or any of you, would have been able to drink without getting quite ill. As Alice and I made our way to these villages, it took a little bit. It took about 4 flights to get to ultimately where we were going in the northern part, sort of on the Caribbean side of Colombia. It was the state, or they call it the department of Magdalena, outside of a city called Santa Marta. But on our way there, so we did Fresno, LA, Houston, Bogota, long layover in Bogota. So we stayed the night in Bogota and then got up and flew into Magdalena. And while we were in Bogota, I actually learned something really fascinating about Bogota. It's actually the world's darkest city. It's the world's darkest city. Now, I don't mean, when I say darkest, I don't mean like evil because you all watch Narcos too much. In fact, Bogota is actually one of South America's safest urban areas with a violent crime rate lower than Indianapolis. Right? It's actually an amazing city full of culture and amazing food. It's just incredible, even though here in the States it has quite a reputation. And it's massive. It's a city of more than 7 million people. But the interesting thing about Bogota, and why it's the darkest city in the world, and not because there's evil there, but because it sits in the Andes about 8,000 feet high, and on average, it only gets about 1,700 hours of daylight a year. Right? That's about 4.5 hours or so, 4 hours and 40 minutes a day of sun. Now, it's sunny that works out to about 39% of the time. The remaining 61% of daylight hours It's cloudy. It's just cloudy. It rains a lot in Bogota, or there's just cloud cover all the time. It's a really unique sort of climate zone in our world. Now compare Bogota, and the darkest city in the world, and only getting about 4 hours of sun a day, to the sunniest city in the world, which is Yuma, Arizona. Yuma gets not 1,700 hours of daylight a year, but 4,000 hours of daylight a year, averaging in the winter about 11 hours of sunlight a day, to the summer 13 hours of sunlight. Now, here's my question for you all. Based on just sunlight statistics, not what you've heard about or whatever, you know, you're terrified of South America for some reason, whatever it is. Just on sunlight hours, how many of you would be like, you know what, Bogota sounds like a good place to live? I'm a Bogota person. Anyone, you like, yeah, some of you, just very, very dark people. I understand that, yeah. And how many of you are Yuma folk? You're like, bring on the sun. Yeah, not all of you are voting. Okay, when I do this, it's like, you gotta vote. Some of you are like, I can't choose. That's a whole other situation that you need to get worked out. So, but here's I just gave you the choice, right? I just gave you the choice, that only about 25% of you actually played, but I gave you the choice essentially between living in light or living in darkness, right? Living in light or living in darkness. And what's really, really fascinating is this is the choice that we're presented again and again by the authors of Scripture. They present this living in light, living in darkness on a spiritual level to us from the very beginning to the very end of this thing that we call the Bible, which is really a library of 66 books. But they're asking us again and again throughout all 66 books, this fascinating choice we're presented with. Would you like to live in light or would you like to live in darkness? The choice is yours, right? They compare the authors, and what's really fascinating is that these authors aren't really talking to each other. I mean, it's this library that we call the Bible is written over 1,500 years, 40 plus authors all over the place, right, geographically, and they all seem to go back to comparing and contrasting and leveraging this light-dark imagery. In fact, I think it's so fascinating, this series that we're doing, Afraid of the Dark, this is what we're gonna do. We're just gonna pull that string that makes its way from the beginning, from book 1 to book 66 of this thing we call the Bible, and they all talk about light and dark. They compare, contrast, and invite a choice from you and I. Do you want to live in light, or do you want to live in darkness? And so for the next 4 weeks in our series, Afraid of the Dark, we're just gonna pull that string, and we're just gonna look at all the different ways that light and dark are presented to us in this thing called the Bible. Now, let me just give you a few examples. I'm just kind of setting things up this morning for the rest of the month, but a few examples of how light and dark gets used by the authors of Scripture. For example, one ancient Hebrew songwriter, he actually called the words of the divine, so the words of God, light. Here's what he said: your word is a lamp for my feet, a light on my path. Israel had a famous poet king, his name was David, and he called God his light and his salvation, right? Here, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? There was an ancient Hebrew prophet, his name was Isaiah, and he uses, again, this light and dark imagery and wrote this: the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. Jesus, like you and I, had very close friends. One of them, probably his best friend, his name was John. And as John aged, he began to write down and reflect upon his time with Jesus of Nazareth. And as an old man, here's how he described Jesus. In him, Jesus, was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The same John, in another document that he's responsible for writing, said that this is the message that we've heard. So hey guys, I'm an eyewitness to this guy Jesus. I heard from him directly, and now I'm telling you that God is light. In him. And he's speaking specifically here of Jesus, that God and Jesus, that Jesus is sort of the fullness of God. God is light. In him, there is no darkness at all. And then if we turn to the very last couple of pages of this thing we call the Bible, it's a book called Revelation, and we're given this imagery of heaven, essentially. And we're told that heaven's going to be a city. And in this city, we're not going to need a sun or a moon. And again, it's metaphor, it's just imagery, a sun or a moon, because all the light we need is going to come from God. Here's how it gets recorded. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives its light. And the lamp, that's imagery that's used of Jesus, is its lamp. Are you beginning to see the theme? Yes, we're seeing the theme a little bit. Again, because the authors, they leverage this light-dark imagery to make a variety of theological, spiritual points and arguments. And they all do it. They all do it. Let me just give you a few. So I just give you some passages. Let me give you, kind of pull out the themes to kind of help us get a handle on this. So they leverage light and dark to tell us a few things. Here's one of the, they leverage light and dark to give us symbols of good and evil, right? Light, and you know this, is often associated with good and righteousness and truth, right? But darkness, right, is associated with evil and deception and all of that. God's also, again, we just read this passage from Jesus' friend John, that God is light. It's telling us something about the character of God. God is often depicted as light, and that there's this sense that every time that we see light, that we're to think about goodness, the goodness of God, the faithfulness of God, that this God is a God that we can trust, right? So every time you turn on a light, every time you light a candle, every time you see a lamp or look up at the sky, you're to be reminded that this is a God you can trust. And it's a God that we see most clearly in Jesus of Nazareth. The third, so symbols of good and evil, God is light, something about the character of God, and then spiritual enlightenment, right? Light symbolizes sort of spiritual understanding, knowledge, enlightenment, right? Remember the words that we just read a moment ago, that the words of the divine are somehow lighting up our path. Fourth, I'd say they use it for revelation. It's God's self-disclosure, if you will. There's a really weird story in the life of Jesus. It gets recorded in one of his biographies that have survived history, where Jesus is up on a mountain praying. And we call this moment the Transfiguration today. But here's what happens. Jesus was transfigured before him. That's why we call it the Transfiguration. His face shone, listen to the light imagery, shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. So again, it's like God's self-disclosure is how light is used, light and darkness. Fifth, I'd say it's, again, used for salvation and redemption. Light's often associated with deliverance from darkness. So you were once in the dark, now you're in the light. And then finally, I'd say transformation. Again, this idea of moving from darkness to light. Listen to how one early Christian talks about it. His name's Paul. For you were once in darkness, but now you are in the light of the Lord. Live as children of light. If you're going to understand anything about this library we call the Bible, we've got to know that there's just a variety of themes that they all seem to pick up on. They all seem to use very similar imagery. Not all the time, but if there are a few pictures we're given that seem pretty consistent. If you were here for our last series, How to Get Unstuck, we pulled on one of those strings because there's, again, one of the themes that we find running throughout the whole library is the theme of moving from bondage to freedom. Right? There's this story that's sort of the story in the Bible. It's called the Exodus. The people of Israel were enslaved by the Egyptians, and they were brought out of slavery and into freedom. Well, that theme of slavery to freedom, that theme moves its way all the way through, just like light and darkness. And so when we pick up the Bible, say you just go home and you pick it up and you start reading, it's important to know. That if you're going to understand what you're reading, that there are these themes. And that's why we're going to spend the next few weeks just talking about this theme and all of the different ways it shows up. And this is where we're going to land for just a few minutes this morning. maybe the most important thing that we've got to understand about this light-darkness imagery is that it begins at the very beginning. Let me show you. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. Okay, I think to really understand what's happening here, let me just remind us all and make sure we're on the same page that this comes from the very first page of the Bible. It's a book that we call the book of Genesis. This is like sentence 3 in the whole Bible, right? And it's telling the story of the creation of the world. Perhaps you've heard the story, right? That God created the world in 6 days and he rested on the seventh day. Well, that's all happening on the first page of the book of Genesis. It's a wildly debated page of the Bible, largely, I think, misunderstood part of the Bible. And most often, the way we approach passages like this has been to see it as some sort of scientific textbook, that it's making commentary on any sort of theories about the creation of the world. We read it oftentimes as though the ancient Hebrew people had some sort of concept of our modern scientific understandings. They, in fact, though, did not. And I think we get a lot more out of this first page of the Bible, these words of Genesis chapter 1, when we step away from sort of seeing it as a how-to guide and begin to just ask the question, why were these words written down in the first place? What was going on that would inspire somebody to write these words? And please, you know how we roll around here. Feel free to disagree with me. You don't have to agree with me. And if you do disagree with me, you know the rules. Don't tell me about it. Whatever. I don't care. It's totally fine. You don't have to agree with me to be a part of Neighborhood Church and our family here. So again, feel free to disagree with me here, but I think Genesis chapter 1 is trying to tell us a lot more about the kind of God that we're going to be introduced to in this Bible, rather than, say, for example, how old the earth is. So with that in mind, let's read these words again. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from darkness. Okay, one observation. God did not create the darkness, right? Darkness is simply the absence of light. Darkness is the condition in which our eyes cannot detect any light. God did not create the darkness, but he apparently does want to do something about our darkness. Now, in the ancient Middle East, this is so important. In the ancient Middle East, darkness represented chaos. Everyone say chaos. Chaos. God isn't the creator of darkness. He's not the creator of chaos. However, he apparently is the creator of light, that which separates us from darkness or from chaos. God is creating this thing that separates us from chaos. God is the creator of the thing, light, that would tame the chaos in our lives. Let me show you what I mean. So, can we dig in a little this morning? Is that okay? We're going to get into it for just a minute. But here's the whole "let there be light," that's like sentence 3. Let me show you basically sentence 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. Okay, here's how we're going to get into it. You guys know this because we talk about it all the time. The Bible did not fall out of the sky like last year written in English, right? It's an ancient book written in a variety of languages, one of them being what we call biblical Hebrew. I say biblical Hebrew because the Hebrew that the Jewish people speak today in Israel is not the same Hebrew. The biblical Hebrew is essentially a dead language. The only people that speak it are like super nerd Bible scholars, right? That's it. And the biblical word that we translate as formless or empty or a formless void is the word tohu bohu. Everyone say that with me. Tohu bohu. Now I know you're like, Forrest, please, what are you talking about? Just hang with me. I promise it matters. It really does. So tohu means formless. Bohu means empty or a void. Tohu bohu, just think chaos. Utter chaos. And the entire chapter of Genesis, this Genesis chapter 1, it's written not so much to tell us how old the world is, it's written to tell us how God is going to respond to the chaos in our world. And that God is gonna be the guy that tames the chaos. And to do so, his first order of business is to create light, to separate the chaos from the ordered world. Genesis 1 is telling us that our world looks the way our world looks because God tamed the chaos. He brought light in the midst of darkness, and he separated the two. Does that make sense? You tracking with me? Okay, today I'm focusing on God's first order of business, right? Creating light, separating darkness and light, chaos from tamed chaos, right? But if we were to look at the whole 6 days of creation, what we'd see is actually a fairly systematic approach to how Genesis 1 is written. So let me just show you. Here's, so days 1 through 3, if you go home and read it, what you'll find is that God's creating space. He's taming the chaos, he's creating order. So he's separating light from darkness, he's separating water above from water below. He moves the ocean to create space on dry land. So he's creating space. Days 4 through 6, he's filling the space, right? We've got sun, moon, stars, birds, sea creatures, other animals, humans. It's like a whole thing. Think of it like this. Now, do you guys have game night, like at your house? Or you kind of do a game night, or you bring friends over, or whatever, there's game night. I don't know about you, but my 10-year-old, she's been into occasionally when she does want to play a board game with me. It's Monopoly, which is like, this game, it's going to take days. Like, it's just, and then when she cheats, it just goes on and on and on, and then when I cheat, because I don't want to lose to a 10-year-old, right? But here's what happens. Every single time, this is true at our house, maybe it's not true of your house. The table, like the kitchen table, for example, that we want to do the game on, there's stuff on the table. It's a mess, right? You can't just throw the game board on. The table's stacked with like junk mail and backpacks and old snacks and grocery lists and weird sticky stuff that we're not sure how it got there, but it's one of our kids' fault for sure. Right? And we can't play the game until we make room for the board and the stacks of money and the place you put all of your, property cards and all of that. And so the first thing we have to do is we have to get to work, systematically clearing off the mess so we can get ready to play. We're not playing the game yet. We're just creating the space where we're gonna play the game, right? Does that make sense so far? You're tracking with me? Now, after we've done all of the preparation, we've cleared off the table, we're ready to put things in their place. The board goes here, the money goes there, the property cards go over here comes our snacks and drinks, right? Everything's taking its proper place around the table so we can begin playing. Well, this is very similar to that graph I just showed you. Can we go back to the graph, or it's not so much a graph, but kind of columns? It's cool, we don't have to, it's totally fine. Okay, here we go. So days 1 through 3, hey, it's chaos. The table's a mess, right? We've got to clear off the table before we can set up the game, days 4 through 6, right? We're clearing off the table days 1 through 3. We're putting everything in place, days 4 through 6, so that we can play the game. We begin Genesis chapter 1 with a cluttered kitchen table, dark chaos, right? Tohu bohu, right? And we ask ourselves, the very beginning, how in the world, right, is God going to create the beauty that we see today in our world out of this mess? And just like family game night, right, on days 1 through 3 of creation, God is ordering the chaos. He's clearing off the table, right? He's making space for something brand new. And then on days 4 through 6, he's putting down all of the pieces in his new space. So he's ready, and we're ready to play the game, right? And here's what's really fascinating about all of this. It seems to be happening by God just speaking a word. He just spoke. Let there be light. That's how it all began. Let's separate light and dark. Let's tame the chaos. He just speaks. Now, him just speaking is actually really important because remember, the ancient Hebrew people, they didn't exist in a vacuum. They had all kinds of neighbors, right? The Samaritans, the Egyptians, the Babylonians. And guess what? All of their neighbors had their own gods and had their own religions, and they all had a creation story, every single one of them, right? For example, the Babylonians, they had a creation story that's called the Enuma Elish. And it actually has a lot in common with the creation story that we find in Genesis 1, minus the Genesis 1, it's pretty smooth sailing. Enuma Elish, not so much. For example, the Babylonian god Marduk, he has this long-standing grievance with his great-grandma Tiamat, and they didn't have family therapy then. And so what Marduk decides to do is just fillet grandma in half, just cut her in half. And that's how he separates the chaos and tames the world. He uses the halves of grandma's body to do that. This is the barrier. And what Genesis 1 is telling us, and why it's so important that we understand that God's just speaking, is that they're making a statement about their God. That their God doesn't tame chaos by creating chaos and murdering people and cutting them in half. All this God has to do is say the word. And darkness is separated from light. Our God, they called him Yahweh. Yahweh can just speak things. Genesis 1 is written to tell the nation of Israel that their God, and not the gods of the Babylonians or the Egyptians or the Samaritans or Assyrians or anybody else, that he's the one true chaos tamer. And because he is, this God is the one God that's worthy of our worship. That's what Genesis 1 is telling us. And listen, it's this light, dark, taming the chaos. Yes, it's big and it's cosmic and it's grand and it's the whole universe kind of stuff. But it's also deeply personal. Think right now, if you just had to, where are those places in your life that you could define as chaos or dark? Where is it just not working? Is there a relationship? Is it work? Is it a parent-child? Where is there chaos? Genesis 1 was written, yes, to tell us what God was up to on a cosmic scale. Genesis 1 was written also so that when we're experiencing chaos, we remember there's a God who wants to shine the light of his love, the deepest level and the deepest, darkest corners of our life. There's a God who wants to and can tame the chaos. And from a Christian perspective, we say this God's name is Jesus. We've seen that God's been working from the very beginning to transform darkness into light, chaos into order, big picture, and in your life. In fact, there's this great line, again, from an ancient Hebrew poem. I just love it because it's just so simple. You, Lord, you keep my lamp burning. My God turns my darkness into light. My God tames the chaos that sometimes feels like it's taking over my life. He separates the darkness and brings light and love and hope, right? With Jesus, chaos doesn't get to have the last word. Love does. Love does. And we all need that at times in our life personally, times in our world as well. I flew home from Colombia. I turned on the news. Israel and Palestine are at war. It's chaos, and it's dark, and it's horrible. We should be praying and asking God, who tames the chaos and darkness, to intervene here, right? I mean, they've been fighting for all of history. But we believe that with Jesus, chaos doesn't get the last word here. Love does. That there's hope, even in what seems like a hopeless situation, that maybe two people could figure out how to get along. When our lives feel like they're in chaos, when we're surrounded by the uncertainty of darkness, we are to remember Genesis 1, and that with a single word, God brought order. And this is so important, and this very Jesus, this is a very Christian perspective. Whatever order, love, compassion, whatever you've experienced that's good and light that you have, that's to be given away. We don't just be like, oh, I ran into Jesus and now my chaos has turned to order and my darkness has turned to light. Yay for me. Never. It's always great. Now go do that for someone else. Like the whole Jesus thing is that we're plan A for getting the love of Jesus to the rest of the world, right? That we're to partner with him in being bringers of light, in separating light and darkness, of taming chaos. And from a Christian perspective, we see that we do that best when we learn to operate out of the way of love, the way of Jesus. That we learn to, no matter what, love other people. That's God's posture towards all of humanity. And honestly, I will just tell you, I saw this so clearly when I was in Colombia this last week. I sat on a dirt floor in a mud hut, and I talked to a single mom who was born in that hut, and now she's raising her 6 children in the same mud hut. No fault of their own. They were born there. And to talk to my 10-year-old and say, they didn't do anything wrong. They were born here. You were born in a completely different situation. And I asked the mother, what do you hope for your children? What do you hope for your children? You know what she said? That they could, the first thing she said, before she said, I hope that they can get out of here and college and all that, I hope that we could have clean drinking water. And then I sat down with a bunch of teen moms who were just starting the program out. And I held their babies as Compassion International is there teaching them how to take care of their infants. And I listened to them tell me about their hopes and dreams for their new babies. I spent time with preschoolers and elementary kids, and ultimately I spent time with teenagers and early 20-somethings who are wrapping up their time with Compassion. And they've told me they were in the Compassion Project for 13 years, 14 years, 15 years. They've had a team of people just investing in their lives for thousands of hours over the period of their life, that they've just been given opportunity after opportunity. And they were so excited about graduating the Compassion program because so many of them had already received invitations to start university and to study engineering and law. And Alice, our 10-year-old, actually, some of them were already in trade schools, and so our Alice got a full Manny by some of the young women that were in the cosmetology training program. It was pretty cool to watch. And these kids, they're quite literally being released from poverty in the name of Jesus. All because there's just a group of people who understood that when this place we call home got its start, the first thing God did was separate the light from the darkness and remind us that there's hope, that he tamed the chaos, that he says chaos doesn't get to define your life. Light does, hope does, love does. And now, the whole plan, the whole strategy is to send out the people who get it to go do that, to just be that. And sometimes you're in Colombia, and other times It's bringing Halloween candy on Sundays so we could have enough Halloween candy for our trunk or treat event at the Houston Park in a couple of weeks. I mean, it looks all sorts of different ways, but when we say, hey, we're for Visalia, we want to add value to the place we call home, underneath that is Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, and let there be light. Let's tame the chaos. So we bring candy, and we decorate our trunks, and we do all sorts of crazy things because we believe chaos doesn't get the last word in anybody's life, love does. And we're to be the bringers of that love. There's a string that gets pulled through all 66 books of this library, light and dark. Hope and love and compassion, order, chaos, darkness, hate, right? All the different ways and stories we can tell to separate ourselves from each other, right? God started the whole thing by saying, let's first clear the kitchen table so we can play the game. That's our job. So now we go out. I mean, this is great. I love it. I love the crowds. I love that I get to talk to everybody. It's so fun. But mostly what I love is when y'all go out and just love people. Because that's our job. We tame chaos. We bring light. And we tell people, and by our actions and our words, darkness doesn't get to have the last word in your life. And I'll do everything I can to make sure that's true. We doing okay? Yeah, I know, that's a lot today. What was the Hebrew word I taught you? You're making me feel like a failure. So tohu, bohu, right? Formless, empty, chaos, okay? Hey, let me pray for us. Jesus, thanks so much for today. Thanks so much that you're the light that we've been waiting for, that you're the one who tames the chaos, shows us the light at the end of whatever dark tunnel we may find ourselves in. And Jesus, let us just be the kind of people that remind everyone else by how we care for them, speak to them, interact, our posture, that we're for them, that we don't want chaos or darkness for them. So we'll do everything we can to bring light and order. Jesus, we love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Thanks, guys.